So I shall pass to Fenella, who is the Director of Resources for Richmond and Wandsworth local authorities. So over to you, Fenella.
So thank you, Anne. Hello,
Pleasure.
everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. So thank you for inviting us again. So we came to this event this time last year, and I know from what you've said that the feedback on that was good, and there was some good interaction with that. So thank you for inviting us again. This is a critical part of our budget setting process. It's actually a statutory part of our process. So it's really, really important that we're given this opportunity to engage with local businesses on our budget setting plans for the next year, and also to give some opportunity for local businesses to speak to the council about our interactions with them. So that's
understood.
So that's the kind of the purpose of the session. So I've got two colleagues with me on the call that are going to help with our presentation. The first one is struggling to get in, so I will pass over to Catherine when she gets into the presentation, so I can cover her content in her absence. And then
thank you, Fenella.
Alex Wilson is with us, who is going to follow on after me and deal with the business rates side of the council's business. I'm just opening the slides, and then I understand that Mark is going to kindly share his screen and show some slides.
Fine.
So Mark, if we could go to the first one, please. Thank you. So I'm Fenella, Catherine's struggling to get in, and Alex will come on later. So if you could go to the next slide, please.
Brilliant.
Thank you. So I've said a little bit about why we're here. As you probably guess, we are in the middle of setting our budgets for the coming year, which includes council tax and business rates as well. We do have a statutory duty to consult with business rate payers, and this is the process by which we do that. We will be releasing our budget papers very shortly, and those papers will be discussed at the council's for formal approval by the full council at its meeting on the 8th of March. So the overall position for the council's budget for next financial year is total spend of £288 million in the coming year, and this table shows you the breakdown of where that spend sits. The majority of our spend, as you can see, is on adult social care and children's services. So 56% of our budget goes on those two service areas, largely to do with social care provision. So ultimately, a fairly small number of the borough's residents incur the majority of the council's spend, actually, because of those services. Yep. We've also obviously got borough-wide services in there, like environment and community services, street cleaning, waste collection, leisure, libraries, parks, all those kinds of services. And then housing and regeneration is an increasingly getting increasingly bigger as the impact of the cost of living crisis hits, and we're seeing more homelessness presentations in the borough. So housing and regeneration are seeing the impact of that on their budgets. If we go on to the next slide, this shows how we fund our services. So the £288 million on the previous slide, as you can see, the majority of that is funded from council tax. So Richmond has overall an average level of council tax across the country, and is heavily reliant on its council tax, largely because it gets very little government grant relative to other London boroughs, and that's about the makeup of the borough and the different factors that the government feeds into its national funding formula. And Richmond, as I said, is deemed to be a relatively affluent borough and has low levels of deprivation that feed into those formulae, which means government grant, in particular revenue support grant, which is shown there as a 0, that's the grant that the government would usually use to fund London services, and Richmond receives no funding in that category. So as a result, a majority of our spend is covered by council tax. Customer and client receipts are receipts from the users of our services, so parking charges, leisure charges, library charges, that kind of thing, wedding fees, etc.
Yes.
And a really important part of the pie is our business rates income. So as you all probably know, the council doesn't set your business rates. It's actually set at a level by national government, but the council has the legal duty to collect business rates and gets to keep some of those business rates to fund local services. Next slide, please. So as well as the revenue side, we've also got a 3-year capital programme, 5-year capital programme actually, and we've got a significant amount here. There's £173 million worth of capital spend planned in the next 3 years. The largest part of that, as you can see, is in Finance and Policy Committee, and that is largely because we've just had a formal approval of the Twickenham Riverside development. That went to committee and was approved in January, and so we've now started to budget for the impact of that scheme. There's also additional spending there for the Ham Close regeneration scheme, which is being led by Richmond Housing Partnership. But in order to facilitate that scheme, the council needs to invest in that scheme in order for RHP to deliver it. So that is showing in there. Education, as you'd expect, is largely to do with maintaining our school estate, but also we've got additional school places being planned, and there are additional schools in the pipeline, particularly for Richmond. Special education needs schools are relied upon in our plans because we have a shortfall of places, and it's increasingly difficult to find suitable in-borough and mainstream education for some of our children. So increasing the offer on our special schools is part of our programme. We've also got, as you would expect, transport, so public realm, improving the roads and highways and investing in our town centres. Town Centre Investment Fund is in their public realm improvement fund as well. So some public realm interventions around our town centres as part of the capital programme as well. And we've also got in adults and housing, we've got a £12 million property acquisition programme that started this year. This is where we are purchasing properties, residential properties in the borough to help with our affordable housing needs. The next slide, please, Mark. Okay, so the majority of the funding, as you can see, for that capital programme is coming from borrowing. We borrow to invest. We do as you'd expect, a financial appraisal to check whether borrowing is affordable, and at the level that we've got in the capital programme, we consider that it is at the moment. Borrowing rates are relatively high at the moment, so we make sure we time our borrowing to best effect to minimise the impact of the cost of borrowing on our budgets. We also do receive some grant that's largely to do with schools, and we do get some grant from the Mayor of London for our housing acquisition programme that I mentioned, and then developer contributions. So this is where development in the borough, residential development in the borough, generates community infrastructure levy or other planning related obligations that come to the council. And capital receipts follow when we identify assets that are for sale, or where we generate receipts on the back of a wider scheme. So for instance, Twickenham Riverside involves generating some receipts from private housing in order to facilitate and fund the affordable housing on the site.
Yeah.
Thank you. So what happened last year? So this slide relates to the previous financial year. In revenue, we had an underspend at the year end, and that was caused largely by our services not yet having fully returned to normal following COVID. So we redirected, as you would have thought, during that year, we redirected quite a lot of our energy into a COVID response. And that did mean that some of our kind of more business as usual services were operating at a lower level, largely because with lockdowns and people not necessarily coming back to services straight away, we didn't have to spend the level that we had before. We've also had actually an impact on our funding, because actually some of the service areas that rely on service users paying for services haven't yet fully recovered. So leisure income is a particular area where we haven't seen a full bounce back from COVID. But there's lots of things going on in the borough now. We can see weddings. There was definitely a backlog of weddings, so we've seen an increase in income from registrars and from kind of some of the functions. Filming is going great in Richmond. I think we've had some significant. I've seen a couple of famous people walking down Church Street recently. So we are having a bounce back in some areas, but just worth remembering that some of those areas haven't fully recovered. Parking income hasn't actually fully recovered from pre-COVID. So in a kind of in not necessarily what we would have planned, but there is definitely a change in people's behaviours in terms of parking and using their car to get around the borough, and that's still feeding into some of our finances. The government funded the cost of COVID in full for Richmond, which we managed our budgets very well during that period. So we managed to cover all of our costs from government grant. And also in last year's accounts, we received our funding agreement for schools, which we have a funding shortfall in what we call our dedicated schools budget, which is running at effectively an in-year deficit because of the high cost of finding placements for children with special educational needs. And as I mentioned earlier, a big part of our capital programme plan over the next 3 years is to increase the number of SEN places that we have in the borough. So the government has agreed a funding settlement with us to get that under control, and we successfully received the payment in 21-22 because our plan is on track to bring that deficit into the balance. So at the end of the year, our reserve balances were slightly boosted at year end, but as you'll see when we look forward, there are significant financial pressures that mean that we will be relying on those to help us tackle the overall financial position. Okay, so next slide, please. One thing that we've done very specifically in the past 6 months, financial response. So the council has set aside £3 million from its reserves. So relying on the fact that those reserves at the end of 21-22 were higher than we previously budgeted for, we've put £3 million aside as a response to cost of living. There are lots of different things that the council is doing across a number of different work streams, working with a number of different partners and stakeholders to really make sure that our response to the cost of living crisis is as good as it can be, not just for residents. A lot of the support is going to residents who, we're finding that there are financially vulnerable households that are really being tipped over the edge by the current financial circumstances. So we're targeting our support at households that are struggling, but also very, very keen to make sure that local businesses are also able to follow, to survive through this economic challenge. And hopefully you will have dealt with some of our council staff who are working incredibly hard on some of the very specific interventions that are there as part of our response to support local businesses. So we've just announced funding for, I think, 2 more rounds of a Shop Local campaign, Shop Local Richmond, which will be, I think that's ongoing at the moment. Lots of advice for SMEs as part of our programme with the Economic Development Office. Broader financial resilience work, and that's not just for businesses but also for residents as well. And this concept of warm spaces where we're trying to get people to come into centres and to encourage people to take advice from staff who are in there who are able to advise them on things like wider financial resilience. We're doing lots of stuff about green as well. A big part of this cost of living crisis, I think, is linked to energy costs, and so being able to support residents and businesses with making their homes and their businesses greener and more energy efficient is a really good long-term response to the cost of living crisis, and also that fits in with the council's wider priorities around making the borough greener. Thank you. So next slide. So this is moving on then. So this is the reason we're here. We're here to consult with you on the 23-24 budget. And the first thing that we are going to cover here is the pressures that we're feeling. So as I mentioned, for 21-22, we did underspend at the end of the year, but we didn't feel that that was a particularly typical year. We're starting to see some backlog in demand coming through from COVID. Certainly in this financial year, we've seen a big increase in demand, particularly around mental health services, both adults and children's actually. And so that's really starting to manifest itself. Possibly that was held back by COVID, but we think that demand is coming out, but also has possibly been exacerbated by COVID. So that's a really big increasing issue for the council services, and obviously we're linked very closely with the NHS and their services, so it's not just within our gift to deal with that. Hospital discharges was a big focus of COVID, and that still does continue, about getting people out of hospital as quickly as possible, but making sure that when they do come out of hospital, they are given enough support for them to be able to live in a safe environment. So a real pressure on the NHS is leading to a pressure in the council's budgets, because ultimately we have to be able to provide social care packages around those people that are being discharged from hospital. And then general pressures around the care market in particular. So we've really struggled with, during COVID has really shown that the care market overall is very fragile. There is a distinct lack of people that are willing or want to work in that market. That has made the recruitment and retention a real issue. Cost pressures have gone up as well, so we're really working hard with the care market to try and build some resilience into their services. As I mentioned earlier, we've also had a big increase in potential homelessness presentations. So we have a statutory duty to house people and to help people to prevent themselves from becoming homeless, and that is manifesting itself in increased pressure on our budgets, and also an increased pressure on the number of households that we are eligible to find accommodation for. Inflation is definitely something that the council has felt the pinch on this year, and we've had to put in significant additional budget in 22-23, and also obviously, as you'll know, that affects the base budget going forward to reflect higher inflation. Contracts that we have with our contractors will all usually have some kind of inflation provision in them, normally linked to CPI on the anniversary of the contract, say. So we've seen significant cost increases on contracts during the year, as that inflation pressure has started to show itself. And then we do have, as I mentioned, a continuing impact from COVID on our income levels, particularly around leisure and parking, and planning as well, actually. So we're still dealing with the impact of that, and working out whether or not those services are going to bounce back, and what the long-term impact on the council's income sources will be. Okay, so next slide, please, Mark. Thank you. So not all bad news. They were the pressures. We have invested in the budget. We've got, as we mentioned, I mentioned earlier, we've got a £12 million property acquisition programme, which is purchasing properties in Richmond Borough for affordable housing, and that helps to deal with our homelessness pressures and take the pressure off our revenue budgets. We've got public realm improvements within the capital programme, and that is really about very specific tangible interventions around our town centres and open spaces to make those town centres look as nice as they can. We've also got a corporate priority to make the borough as green as possible, and our climate emergency strategy turns that corporate priority into a list of very specific interventions that we've put additional funding into for 23-24. Community safety is another one of the corporate priorities, making the borough safe, and we've invested in things like a violence against women and girls strategy, a nighttime strategy, and very specific interventions around all manner of community safety. Last year we had the Jubilee celebrations. This year we have the coronation celebrations. So we're just about to agree some budget to kick off those celebrations. And I know that as part of that response, local businesses are absolutely part of that plan. So we expect bunting in the town centres and all kinds of street parties and events as part of that. It's a 3-day weekend, and we've got a programme of works and a programme of events across the 3 days. We've also got something called the transformation programme. This is where we are looking across all council services to make sure we are as efficient, effective and financially resilient as we can be, protecting frontline services as much as we can, but recognising that actually the size of the financial challenge ahead of us is such that we need to probably just make sure that our structures are right, that our priorities are right, that we're focusing our energies on the areas that mean the most, and we're feeding in digital transformation into that programme, better commissioning and procurement, and better use of our assets. So the council's got an incredible number of properties across the borough, and we're just making sure that we're using those to best effect, consolidating services where we can possibly, and making more use of the civic centre. You'll be aware of we're about to vacate 42 to 44 York Street. That building will be vacated by council officers and will be turned into an affordable workspace hub and community hub. So, really trying to get the most out of our assets as well. And we've invested in that as part of our budget. Thank you, Mark. Next one. Not to be complacent, we've also pulled some efficiencies together as part of the budget. £5 million of efficiencies around staffing and supplies and services budgets and contract management budgets and procurement and commissioning are included in the budget. I also just mentioned the office estate review that's going on. We're moving our IT services to the cloud, so we're investing in a big digital programme, which is then going to not only make our IT services more robust, but also overall will save the council money. A big part of our approach to net zero by 2030 involves reducing our energy buildings more energy efficient. So we've got a big plan to work our way through a number of buildings, making them more energy efficient. So, for instance, the Civic Centre at the moment is being completely relit to have more energy efficient lighting, and we're going to be rolling that out across a number of our buildings. Procurement and contract savings, definitely something that we're looking at, efficiencies around the contracts that we've got, but also the way we procure and commission. We're particularly adult social care is a big service area where we spend an awful lot of money on different procurements and commissioning, and so really looking at whether we're making the most of the opportunities there. And we've been holding down budgets where we can on inflation. So I mentioned that contracts have specific inflation factors in them. We have negotiated with some of our contractors to apply a lower level of inflation. That is increasingly difficult in the current economic climate, because as you can imagine, contractors are feeling the pinch of inflation just as much as the council. But where we can, we are doing that, and particularly some of our internal budgets around, the money that we spend. So, for instance, a really good one here is training. We are able to facilitate an awful lot of training online now, where we weren't able to before, and that really has meant that we've managed to get efficiencies from those kinds of budgets. And then finally, data analytics. We recognise that the council holds an extraordinary amount of data about its residents and the people that use our services and the businesses in the council, and we really want to be able to bring our data together, analyse it, and do two things effectively: make our service user journey better, and that will be more efficient for the council, but also to analyse what the data is telling us about the kinds of services that we deliver and where best we should be focusing our energy going forward. So really trying to get to this kind of this position where the data is leading and driving our response, not necessarily in a reactive manner, but also proactively. So we've started to see the benefit of that and pulled some budget efficiencies through into the budget on the back of it. Okay, next slide, please, Mark. So what does this all lead to? So the government is allowing councils across the country to increase council tax by up to 4.99% for the next financial year. 2% of that is for those councils who have adult social care responsibilities, and Richmond is one of them, with a 2.99% maximum increase for all other general council services. Any increase above that would require a local referendum. And as you probably have seen over the past few years, that hasn't been something that local authorities have triggered, because ultimately a referendum, number one, costs money to deliver, but also the outcome of that is likely not to support increases above that level. A couple of three councils actually in the country have been given authority, because of their very particular financial circumstances, to increase council tax by more than 4.99%. So, for instance, Croydon has been given the authority by government to increase their council tax by up to 15% for 23-24. Richmond is constrained by 4.99%. Decisions are still being made on that, and they'll be released this week. We're just finalising the figures. Even if Richmond increased council tax by the maximum, there still need to be a contribution from our reserves, so from our savings, to balance that budget. So the £288 million pie we showed at the beginning, that would still need a contribution from reserves in order to balance the budget. We're still committed to helping residents with the cost of living crisis, and we've still got some of the £3 million funding that we set aside to be spent in 23-24, and we'll make sure we maximise that spend and make sure that available resource is given out as quickly as possible to help businesses and residents next year. And then just flagging here that the Mayor of London's decision on the GLA's part of council tax will mean an increase of 9.8%. Some of that is very specifically linked to TfL and police provision, and that will obviously feed into the council's overall council tax bill. Okay. Next slide, please, Mark. Okay, so coming to the end of my slides now, the economic outlook. Not just on residents, but also on the council itself. We're having significant pressures on a lot of our services because of inflation, and we know that businesses will be struggling with this as well. So really that is something that I think is going to continue to be a factor in 23-24. The outlook, as you'll all know, is for inflation to come down, but certainly not to come down to the levels that it was at previously, and it's going to take some time to come down as well. So definitely something for us to be mindful of in 23-24. We've also got the government's overall levelling up agenda, which ultimately we think will take resource away from London. Levelling up is about the rest of the country, and we think that London will either not benefit from additional funding, that's the worst case scenario, or worst case scenario will see funding moved elsewhere into the country. So that's a real threat, I think, for the South East and London in particular. We've also got the government's funding distribution changes, which have been promised or threatened for a number of years, and they keep being deferred. They won't happen now until at least the start of the new parliament. So we've got at least probably 2 years before that kicks in. But again, as with levelling up, that is not likely to be good news for London. Demographic pressures continue. All of London is seeing pressures in particular areas, and Richmond has got a very specific cohort that are driving some of those demographic pressures. As I mentioned earlier, adult social care, always an issue in Richmond because of the demographics, but children's social care as well. Significant pressures on the council. Mental health across both of those service areas, which actually also leads into homelessness pressures, because we find that often those issues are linked. The rate of recovery for Richmond is projected to be ahead of the rest of London. Richmond is a robust economic borough relative to some of the others, so it puts us in a good position overall, but doesn't mean that we are immune to the economic outlook. And we have to obviously see how that impacts on our collection rates for things like council tax and business rates, and the impact that it has on residents and businesses in the borough, and the debts that we need to collect. Ultimately, I mean, I'll let Alex speak about that when she gets onto her section of. But ultimately, we have a statutory duty to collect, but we also need to be recognising the fact that businesses want to trade, and we need to do all we can to facilitate that.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. So I think if you yes, so that's me. I have finished my section of the presentation, Anne. So I will seamlessly hand over to Alex, who will follow through with the last couple of slides.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fenella, and thanks, Anne. So in terms of business rate changes for 23-24, I think the most significant impact on the charges for 23-24 is the revaluation of business properties by the Valuation Office Agency. The Valuation Office agencies base their reassessments on market rental value, and they have written to all the businesses in the borough to advise them of their revised rateable values, but also their rights to appeal. The valuations, although forming part of the calculation for the 23-24 charges, as Fenella muted earlier, they're not in the council's gift. So if businesses are wanting to make an appeal, then they have to do so direct to the VOA. Sorry, I don't think I'd started my video. Apologies for that. It's fair to say that the impact of the revaluations has varied across the business types, with some sectors faring better than others. It's just important to note that there is transitional relief available, which will limit how much a bill can change each year as a result of the revaluation process. So it does.
Alex, would you like the presentation to be running?
Yeah, please.
Mark, would you share the screen? It simply continues the presentation.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Yes.
So yes, in terms of transitional relief, it means if you are eligible, changes to your bill will be phased in gradually, so you don't feel the effect in one go. Bills are due to go out on the 9th of March, and it will be accompanied by a booklet, which, as it does in previous years, which explains how your charge is being calculated, and the information will also be available on the council's website. I just wanted to also say that, you know, we absolutely, as Fenella said, you know, we've got a statutory duty to collect, but we do recognise that some businesses are struggling, and we just encourage early engagement with the council if businesses are struggling to pay their business rates. We are able to if we can have conversations and look at things like payment arrangements, and that's obviously more preferable to the business, but also more preferable to us, because we really do want to avoid having to go down the formal route of recovery action, and in particular, you know, utilising enforcement agents. So please do get in contact with the council if you are struggling. Just in terms of the multipliers that are set nationally, they're used alongside the rateable values to calculate the business rate charges for the year. They've been frozen for 23-24. Obviously that comes at a cost to the council, but we're compensated through government funding to cover the impact that that freezing of the multipliers has. Also, in the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced the introduction of a new business rates relief scheme for retail, hospitality and leisure properties for 23-24. The new business rate relief scheme provides eligible occupied retail, hospitality and leisure properties with 75% relief. That's as opposed to the 50% that was given this year, but just to note that is up to a cash cap limit of £110,000 per business. Thanks, Mark. Next slide, if you could, please. So, as Fenella mentioned earlier, there's a number of initiatives that the council's working on alongside businesses to provide support. A lot of that work is driven by the council's economic development team. These are just some of the examples. So we're working closely with the bids across the authority and local business associations to do promotion around local centres, high streets, etc. And Fenella mentioned the Shop Local campaign, which will profile the high streets and centres, offering marketing awareness and raising opportunities for local businesses. So you know, please try and utilise that if possible. We also have a £3 million public realm improvement fund, which is putting council resources into repairing the wear and tear of some parts of the borough that have suffered during the pandemic. That includes funding improvements to high streets and town centres, because obviously we recognise the importance of trying to encourage local visitors. So there's lots of projects going on, and those are, you know, very much about working alongside the businesses in the borough to make sure we engage with you properly and get your valuable input. We also have the Phoenix Enterprise Programme, which is effectively a mentoring programme to foster and encourage business growth, particularly post the pandemic. So far, it's supported over 1,000 businesses, of which 140 are new startups. It's ending in the summer, but the economic development team are redesigning and commissioning a successor offer. There's a vast range of business support out there. Sort of central to it all is the Richmond Business Hub, which brings all of this together and is kind of the gateway. So I would encourage businesses to go onto that hub and seek support and advice if they need to do so. The council also has an employment and skills strategy. We recognise there's been significant changes in the labour market since the pandemic, and there's an increasing number of our residents who are, you know, struggling to get employment and don't have the necessary skills necessary. So, and same with businesses trying to get the right skills to fill vacant posts that they've got. So the strategy has a number of objectives. The first is ensuring that those who are impacted by the cost of living crisis in Richmond have access to sustainable jobs, and they also have access to appropriate learning to upskill, so they're able to increase their chances of getting employment. There's support around employment and skills for refugees in the borough. We're also doing some work around procurement, in particular, making sure we've got social value commitments built into our specifications to cover off employment and skills. Fenella also mentioned some of the work we're doing around the sort of green agenda, so working with South London Green Skills Academy to map employers' needs for green jobs available in the borough. And last but not least, in terms of our objectives in the strategy, it's about supporting local businesses to hire talented local staff and ensuring that skills provision meets the needs of employers. So it's bridging that gap between the kind of current skills market and the needs of businesses in the community. We also have the Richmond Works Match, which is the council's job brokerage service. It organised the Employ Richmond's Job Fair, which I think it was the 27th of January that was held, and that was really, really positive. It attracted over 450 local job seekers, which was well ahead of expectations. So So that proved incredibly successful. Fenella also mentioned the affordable workspaces. Obviously, with post-COVID, businesses are demanding more flexible and affordable workspaces, particularly with the increased numbers of businesses offering home working. So it really has changed the structure of the local market. So as Fenella mentioned, the council's invested in one of its buildings, 42 York Street, to create an enterprise and innovation hub. We'll also join a network of similar workspaces run by the likes of Richmond and Hillcroft College, and also the library service. I would just encourage businesses to, if they're looking for additional support, to contact Richmond Business, to contact the economic development team, but also access the Richmond Business Hub as well. The final thing, again, that Fenella alluded to was the work we're doing around helping businesses with energy efficiencies. So the council's working with Better Futures Plus and a local energy company called Crew Energy to develop support to businesses and voluntary sector organisations who are operating in Richmond. That's to help them address some of the concerns they have around rising costs of energy, but also to help them contribute to reducing their carbon emissions. Support so far, we've held 3 workshops. We've also done 32 site visits to businesses and helped with financial modelling, and made recommendations to help improve their energy efficiency. And if businesses want further advice and support, then if they want to go onto the Better Futures Plus website, then hopefully that will signpost them to get some support that they need around energy efficiency improvements.